world beyond the village of Mudplow was vast, cold, and unforgiving. Tucked into a narrow, mud-slicked valley in the lower reaches of Velen, Mudplow was a place made entirely of wet wood, thatch, and lingering smoke. It sat on the absolute precipice of civilization, where the wagon ruts ended and the ancient, untamed forest began. To the north ran the gray, rushing waters of the river. To the south lay miles of black bogs, and to the east stood the forest, a towering wall of ancient oak, pine, and choke vine so dense that daylight seemed to die the moment it touched the highest canopy. In Mudplow, life moved to the slow, heavy rhythm of survival, and nowhere was that rhythm felt more acutely than inside the village smithy. Milo was 16 winters old, though he had the narrow shoulders and fragile frame of a boy far younger. He was the son of Goran, the village blacksmith, a broad, barrel-chested man whose forearm was thicker than Milo's thigh and whose skin smelled eternally of coal dust, iron rust, and sour beer. Goran was a man of few words, but his hammer spoke for him, ringing out from dawn until dusk as he shaped horseshoes, plowshares, and the occasional rusted hunting spear. Milo, however, had not inherited his father's iron. Where his father was dense and unyielding, Milo was small, quiet, and easily bruised. His lungs burned whenever the heavy bellows drew in the smoky air of the forge, and his arms trembled whenever he attempted to lift the big sledge. He spent his days in the shadowed corners of the workshop, sweeping away gray ash, fetching buckets of cold water from the well, and trying his best to remain invisible. "Keep the fire fed, Milo," his father would grunt, never looking up as he struck glowing orange steel. "A forge without heat is just a cold box of stone. Mind the embers." "Yes, father," Milo would answer softly, his voice swallowed by the hiss of steam as hot metal was plunged into the quenching trough. Milo hated the heat of the forge, but he feared the world outside it even more. Because outside the smithy lay the village, and inside the village was Bram. Bram was the son of the village elder, a large, cruel lad with thick knuckles, a sneering mouth, and eyes like cold river stones. Bram was everything Milo was not: strong, arrogant, and favored by the older men. While Milo swept ashes, Bram spent his days hunting rabbits at the treeline or drinking stolen mead behind the granary. And Bram's favorite pastime was Milo. On this particular late autumn afternoon, the sky above Mudplow was the color of a bruised plum. A cold, relentless rain drizzled down, turning the dirt tracks into thick, boot-sucking mud. Milo had been sent out with 2 empty wooden buckets to fetch water from the lower well, the one near the edge of the perimeter fence that separated the village huts from the dark wall of the forest. He wrapped his worn wool cloak tightly around his chest, his boots squelching with every step. The air was heavy with the scent of wet pine, damp soil, and the sour smoke of burning peat from the cottage chimneys. As Milo reached the wooden winch of the well, a harsh, mocking laugh cut through the sound of the falling rain. "Look at him," a voice sneered from the shadows of a nearby hay barn. "The blacksmith's mouse. Careful with those buckets, Milo. Wouldn't want you to break those delicate little wrists." Milo froze, his heart dropping into his stomach. Out from the shelter of the barn stepped Bram. Flanked by 2 of his usual shadows, a tall, dim-witted boy named Peter and a squat, wide-shouldered youth named Joran. Bram carried a heavy, mud-splattered oak branch, resting it casually across his shoulders like a hunter carrying a kill. "I'm just fetching water for the forge, Bram," Milo said softly, keeping his eyes fixed on the wet ground, trying to keep his voice from shaking. "My father needs it." "Your father needs a real son," Bram laughed. Stepping forward into the mud, he planted a broad hand against Milo's chest, shoving him backward. Milo stumbled, the wooden buckets clattering against the stones of the well head. "Look at you, shivering like a wet hound. You know my father says a boy who can't hold a hammer shouldn't take up space in the village. Leave him be, Bram." The voice was quiet, but it made Milo's chest ache in a completely different way. Stepping out from the doorway of the herbalist's hut across the road was Anka. She was the herbalist's daughter, a girl with bright, solemn eyes and dark hair pulled back in a simple braid. She carried a basket of dried lavender wrapped in oilskin, protecting it from the rain. Milo felt a surge of deep, burning embarrassment. Of all the people in Mudplow, Anka was the only one who had ever spoken to him with gentleness. When he had burned his hand on a hot iron bar 2 winters ago, it was Anka who had applied cooling comfrey salve to his blisters while her mother grumbled. Milo had harbored a quiet, unspoken love for her ever since, a secret he guarded more fiercely than anything else. And now she was watching him cower in the mud. Bram turned toward Anka, his sneer shifting into a greasy, performative smile. "Ah, sweet Anka, don't worry your pretty head. We're just helping little Milo build some character. Isn't that right, Mouse?" Before Milo could answer, Bram kicked one of the wooden buckets. It struck Milo squarely in the shin, sending a jolt of sharp pain up his leg. Milo gasped, dropping to one knee in the cold slop. Peter and Joran snickered while Bram took a step closer, towering over him. Bram leaned down, his breath smelling of stale ale and onions. "What's the matter, blacksmith's boy? Going to cry for your father, or maybe for Anka?" Milo looked up, meeting Bram's eyes for a brief second. Panic, humiliation, and a spark of helpless rage coiled in his throat. He didn't think, he simply reacted. With all the strength in his small frame, Milo shoved Bram's leg and scrambled up, turning to run. He didn't run toward the forge, he didn't run toward his father. In his blind panic, he ran the only way his frantic feet would carry him, past the well, past the low, moss-covered boundary stones, and straight into the dark, silent shadows of the ancient forest. "Hey, get back here, you little coward," Bram's voice echoed behind him, followed by the sound of heavy boots splashing through the mud in pursuit. "Run all you want, Milo. The woods will eat you alive." The air grew instantly colder as Milo broke through the tree line. The open rain settled into a heavy, quiet drip as the vast canopy overhead swallowed the sky. Roots twisted out of the earth like buried bones, and thick gray fog hung in the air like shredded wool. Behind him, he could hear Bram and the others shouting, their voices muffled and warped by the dense wood. Milo kept running, his lungs burning, his feet slipping on wet moss and fallen leaves, plunging deeper and deeper into a dark world where no villager ever dared to tread. The boundary stones of Mudplow were meant to mark where the law of men ended and the wild world began. They were ancient, moss-covered monoliths, carved with forgotten warding runes, pitted by centuries of rain and ice. No sane villager crossed them after twilight. To step beyond the stones was to surrender oneself to the cold mercy of Velen. Milo did not care. His boots slammed into the wet, rotting loam of the forest floor, spraying dark mud against his trousers. His chest heaved, each breath burning in his throat like swallowing glass. Behind him, the harsh, echoing shouts of Bram and his cronies grew fainter, muffled by the oppressive density of the pines. "Milo, where are you running, little rat?" Bram's voice drifted through the fog, warped and distant. "We'll find you. You have to come back to the forge eventually." Milo didn't look back. He ducked under a low-hanging branch draped in gray, bearded lichen, his shoulder clipping the rough bark. He plunged straight down a steep, slippery embankment, tumbling through a thicket of sharp blackbriar thorns that tore at his woolen cloak and left long, stinging scratches across his cheeks. He scrambled to his feet at the bottom of the gully, gasping, and paused to listen. The forest had swallowed the sound of the village entirely. There was no more clinking from his father's anvil, no lowing of cattle, no distant voices from the well. There was only the steady, rhythmic dripping of rainwater filtering down through the thick canopy overhead and the frantic, pounding thud of his own heart. Milo leaned against the trunk of a massive, dying elm, his hands resting on his knees as he fought for air. Tears of cold humiliation mixed with the rain on his face. He could still see Bram's sneering face, still feel the sharp jolt of the wooden bucket striking his shin, still hear the snickers of Peter and Yoran, and worst of all, he could still see Anka standing in the rain, watching him cower like a beaten cur. "Why?" Milo whimpered to the silent trees, his voice barely a breath. "Why am I like this?" He looked down at his trembling hands. They were pale, thin, and calloused only from broom handles and water buckets. His father, Goran, was a man carved from oak and iron, a man who could lift a wagon wheel with one arm and beat hot steel into shape for hours without tiring. Yet Milo felt as if he had been made from leftover scraps, fragile and soft, meant only to be stepped on. A sudden sharp breeze blew through the gully, carrying a strange, heavy scent. It wasn't the fresh smell of rain or the familiar pitch of pine. It smelled of ancient rot, damp earth turned over after a century, dried blood, and bitter crushed herbs. Milo shuddered. He turned around, realizing for the first time just how far he had run. The trees here were different. They were ancient, towering behemoths with bark so dark it looked charred, their roots twisting out of the earth like the exposed ribs of buried giants. Thick gray fog clung to the forest floor, swirling around his ankles like cold water. The light was dying rapidly. Twilight was settling over Velen, painting the woods in shades of deep indigo and ash gray. He was lost. Deep in the heart of the woods, far past where even the village woodcutters dared to venture. Panic, cold and sharp, seized his chest. Milo took a cautious step backward, intending to retrace his path up the muddy embankment, when his boot caught on something hard buried beneath the wet leaves. He tripped, falling heavily onto his hands and knees. He groaned, rubbing his scraped palm, and looked down to see what he had kicked. Half buried between two sprawling, mossy roots of the dying elm sat a strange, crude structure. It was no larger than a horse's skull, fashioned from dark, twisted birch twigs woven tightly together with dried gut. Bound to the center of the bundle was a bleached animal skull, a fox or a badger, its jaw missing, crowned with a cluster of black crow feathers and small dried mountain ash berries. A Leshen's totem. Milo froze, every instinct screaming at him to pull back, to scramble away, to run until his legs gave out. Every child in Mudplow grew up hearing tales of the forest spirits, the ancient wooden guardians that ruled the deep woods. The elders spoke of them in hushed, frightened tones around winter fires, warning that their totems were dark, holy things, bound to the heart of the forest by blood and old magic. "Touch a totem," the old stories said, "and the forest will mark you." Yet, as Milo stared at the bleached bone resting in the damp moss, he felt no threat. The terror that had chased him into the woods began to quiet down, replaced by a strange magnetic pull. A low, barely audible hum seemed to vibrate through the earth beneath his knees, rising up through his hands and settling deep within his collarbone. The totem was not cold like the rain. It seemed to pulse with a faint, buried warmth, like a dying ember beneath a heap of ash. "Look at you." A quiet thought drifted through Milo's mind. Not a voice, but a feeling, heavy and ancient. Small, broken, driven into the dirt by those weaker than the trees. Milo reached out his right hand. His fingers trembled violently, hovering mere inches above the crow feathers and the smooth, pale bone. "Just a piece of wood," he whispered to himself, trying to anchor his mind. "Just twigs and bone." His fingertips brushed the forehead of the animal's skull. Instantly, the quiet drip of the rain vanished. The cold chill in his bones evaporated. A violent, scorching jolt of energy surged from the totem, driving up his arm like liquid fire. Milo gasped, his eyes flying wide as his back arched. It wasn't pain. It was an overwhelming, terrifying rush of raw, unadulterated power. He felt his pulse hammer against his ribs, heavy and slow, like the strike of an iron hammer on a cold anvil. The faint, fragile ache in his muscles vanished, replaced by a dense, unnatural weight. His vision sharpened. In the gathering gloom of the forest, he could suddenly see every line in the bark, every drop of rain clinging to the pine needles, every swirl of fog drifting over the roots. He pulled his hand back, gasping for air, falling onto his side in the wet leaves. His chest rose and fell in deep, steady rhythms. The fear that had defined his entire life, the constant crouching anxiety that lived in his stomach, was gone. In its place was a quiet, heavy stillness. Milo slowly pushed himself up from the mud. He looked down at his hands. They were still thin, still covered in scraped skin and dirt. But when he clenched his fingers into fists, he felt a thrilling, terrifying surge of coiled strength beneath his skin. He turned toward the direction of Mudplow. The woods were dark now, filled with night shadows, but Milo felt no dread. He took his first step back toward the village, his boots sinking into the mud, not as a frightened boy fleeing from bullies, but as something else entirely. Night had fallen completely over Mudplow by the time Milo crossed the boundary stones. The rain had settled into a steady, cold drizzle that slicked the thatched roofs and filled the wagon ruts with pools of dark water. Golden light spilled from the shuttered windows of the timber cottages, casting long, trembling shadows across the muddy lane. Under normal circumstances, returning home past dusk meant a stern reprimand from his father and a cold meal of stale rye bread and lard. Tonight, Milo felt no apprehension. He walked with a slow, deliberate stride, his boots sinking into the slop of the main road. The cold air no longer made him shiver. The unnatural warmth he had absorbed from the bone totem still hummed beneath his skin, heavy and dense, like a coil of hot iron resting inside his chest. As he approached the central square near the village well, a group of figures stepped out from the overhang of the granary. It was Bram, flanked as always by Peter and Joran. They were huddled around a small, smoking brazier, taking turns pulling from a clay jug of cheap plum spirits. When Bram caught sight of Milo walking out of the dark, his sneering face lit up with cruel amusement. "Well, look what crawled back out of the bushes," Bram called out, tossing his jug to Peter and stepping into the rain. "I thought the wolves had gotten you, little mouse, or did you spend the whole evening hiding in a hollow log, crying for your mother?" Peter and Joran chuckled, stepping up beside him. In the past, the mere sound of Bram's voice would have made Milo's stomach drop into a cold, sickening knot. He would have kept his head down, mumbled an apology, and hurried past into the dark. Tonight, Milo stopped. He turned slowly to face Bram, his arms hanging casually at his sides. "Step aside, Bram," Milo said. His voice was not loud, but it possessed a strange, resonant stillness that caught Bram off guard. There was no tremor in his words, no frantic breath behind them. Bram blinked, his dark brows knitting together in sudden annoyance. He took a heavy step forward, planting his broad chest mere inches from Milo. "What did you say to me?" "I said step aside." Milo repeated softly, looking straight into Bram's eyes. Bram's face flushed red with anger. "You little piece of filth," he spat, reaching out a thick, calloused hand to grab Milo by the throat and shove him into the mud, just as he had done 100 times before. Milo didn't flinch. As Bram's hand closed around his collar, Milo reached up and grabbed Bram's wrist. The moment their skin met, Milo felt the latent fire beneath his ribs surge down his arm. He didn't slam or strike, he simply squeezed. Bram's sneer vanished instantly. His eyes went wide with shock and sudden, blinding pain. The bone in his wrist creaked under Milo's fingers like dry timber under an axe. A sharp, pathetic gasp escaped Bram's lips as his knees buckled, the sheer, crushing force of Milo's grip bringing the larger boy down into the wet dirt. "Let go," Bram choked out, his voice cracking with panic. "Milo, stop. You're breaking it." Peter and Joran stared in stunned, frozen horror, their mouths agape. They had watched Bram beat grown men in wrestling matches at the summer fairs. Yet here was the smith's frail son holding Bram pinned to the earth with a single hand, looking down at him with dark, emotionless eyes. Milo held him there for 3 long, agonizing seconds, feeling the terrifying, intoxicating, absolute power running through his veins. Then, with a slow exhale, he released his grip. Bram collapsed onto his side in the mud, clutching his purple, bruised wrist to his chest, gasping for air and trembling. He looked up at Milo, not with anger, but with wild, unadulterated fear. Milo didn't say another word. He turned his back on them and walked calmly toward the warm, glowing doorway of his father's smithy. The next morning broke gray and cold over Mudplow. A thick, wet fog clung to the ground, shrouding the village in a ghost-like haze. Inside the smithy, the forge fire was already roaring. Goran stood over the anvil, his broad, soot-stained back glistening with sweat as he worked on a heavy iron rim for a farmer's wagon wheel. The air was thick with the smell of burning charcoal, hot scale, and iron. Milo walked into the workshop, stepping quietly past the racks of tongs and hammers. Goran didn't look up from his work. "You were late last night, boy," he grunted, his voice heavy as a falling log. "And you left the water buckets by the well. I had to fetch them myself before dawn." "I know, Father," Milo said softly. "I'm sorry. Let me help with the wheel." Goran paused, resting his heavy crosspeen hammer against the anvil horn. He turned his deep-set, tired eyes toward his son, sweeping his gaze over Milo's narrow frame. He sighed, a sound of weary resignation. "It's a 2-man job, Milo," Goran said, wiping his brow with a soot-stained sleeve. "The rim is high-carbon iron. It needs to be held square on the anvil with the long tongs while I strike. You don't have the weight for it. Go sweep the coal dust." "I can hold it," Milo insisted gently. Goran grunted, annoyed by the boy's sudden persistence, but he was too tired to argue. He pointed toward a pair of massive, heavy iron tongs hanging on the rack, tools usually reserved for 2 grown men due to their sheer leverage and weight. "Fine. Grab the long tongs, but if you drop the hot iron on your boots, don't come crying to me." Milo stepped up to the rack. He wrapped his fingers around the cold iron handles of the long tongs. Under normal circumstances, lifting them alone would have made his shoulders ache and his arms tremble within seconds. But as his fingers tightened around the metal, the dormant warmth in his chest flared alive once more. Milo lifted the heavy tongs with one hand, swinging them effortlessly through the air as if they were made of dried pine. Goran froze, his eyes widening in subtle disbelief. He watched as his son stepped up to the hearth, plunged the jaws of the tongs into the blinding white heart of the fire, and clamped them around the glowing red-hot iron wheel rim. Without a single wobble or strain, Milo lifted the heavy, scalding piece of steel out of the embers and laid it flat across the anvil face. His arms remained rock-steady, his grip ironclad, despite the searing heat radiating mere inches from his face. "Hold it right there, Father," Milo said calmly. His voice steady as stone, Goran stared at his son. For the first time in 16 years, the old blacksmith did not see a fragile, sickly boy who belonged in the shadows. He saw a man holding hot iron with the effortless, terrifying grace of a master. Goran swallowed hard, his throat dry. Where did you get that strength, Milo?" Milo looked up, meeting his father's gaze through the rising heat waves of the forge. "I found it in the woods, Father," he whispered, "where everything lost goes to be found." A bruised pride in Velen is a dangerous thing. It does not heal. It festers like a swamp wound, turning sour and violent in the dark. For 2 days, Bram kept to the shadowed corners of his father's manor. His wrist was swollen and purple, wrapped in tight linen strips that smelled of vinegar and willow bark. The shame of being brought to his knees by the blacksmith's frail son burned hotter in his chest than any fever. The boys of Mudplow whispered behind their hands whenever he passed, and even Peter and Joran looked at him differently, their eyes filled with a quiet, lingering doubt. Bram knew he could not defeat Milo in a fair contest of strength. Whatever had happened in the woods had turned the mouse into something unnatural. But Bram also knew that strength meant nothing if you could lead a fool by his heart. He knew about Anka. Everyone in the village knew how Milo's eyes lingered on her whenever she carried herbs from her mother's garden. It was a soft, pathetic vulnerability, and Bram intended to use it to tear Milo apart. The sun was sinking below the western hills, painting the sky in streaky bands of bruised violet and cold copper. A heavy, biting frost was beginning to settle over the mud of Mudplow, turning the puddles into thin sheets of cloudy ice. Milo was leaning against the stone rim of the village well, his wool cloak wrapped around him. He felt light, untroubled, and invincible. The power inside him sat like a sleeping beast, quiet, warm, and ready to wake at his slightest command. Milo? The voice was soft, hesitant, and breathless. Milo turned quickly. Standing a few paces away in the fading light was Anka. She wore a heavy woolen shawl over her head, her dark eyes wide and full of an anxious, darting light. She held her hands tightly together beneath her apron, her knuckles white. Milo's heart did a familiar, fluttering leap, but his voice remained steady. Anka, is everything all right? I need to speak with you, she whispered, looking over her shoulder toward the darkened cottages as if afraid of being seen. Not here. There are too many eyes in the square. Milo stepped closer, his chest swelling with a protective warmth. What is it? Has someone bothered you? No. Well, yes, she stammered, her voice trembling slightly. It's about what happened between you and Bram. People are talking, Milo. Terrible things. They say you've brought something evil back from the woods. I was frightened for you. She took a small step forward, reaching out to touch his sleeve. The brief, gentle contact sent a jolt through Milo that felt far sweeter than the dark power of the totem. Meet me by the lake, Anka murmured, her eyes pleading. Just past the reed beds at the eastern bend, where the old fishing pier rots, once the sun dips completely. Please, Milo, I need to know you're safe. Before he could answer, she turned and hurried away into the dusk, her dark shawl fluttering in the cold wind like a crow's wing. Milo stood by the well for a long moment, watching her figure vanish into the twilight. A deep, dizzying pride washed over him. For months he had dreamed of her noticing him, of her looking at him not as a pitiful boy to be saved, but as a man. He didn't notice the faint, unnatural trembling in his fingers. He didn't notice that the deep, burning heat in his chest had suddenly begun to feel hollow, like a fireplace when the last ember turns to gray ash. The lake lay a quarter-mile past the eastern tree line. It was a stagnant, black expanse of water shrouded in high reeds and twisted alder trees that leaned over the shore like stooped old men. A thick, white ground fog clung to the water's surface, creeping onto the muddy bank like cold fingers. Milo walked down the narrow deer trail toward the rotting wooden posts of the old fishing pier. The air here was bitter cold, smelling of dead weeds, mud, and stagnant water. Anka, he called out softly, his voice muffled by the fog. Anka, I'm here. No answer came, only the soft, rhythmic slap-slaps of dark water against the muddy shore. Milo stopped near a clump of willow trees. His brow furrowed. Anka. A heavy branch snapped in the shadows behind him. Milo turned casually, unconcerned. He reached deep into his chest, searching for the dark, liquid fire that had filled his muscles at the forge, the strength that could shatter bone and bend iron. He pulled at it, but there was nothing there. A cold panic, sharper than the winter wind, pierced his stomach. He tried again, digging frantically into his own spirit, searching for the pulse of the totem, but the reservoir was completely bone dry. His muscles felt light, thin, and hollow once more. His heart began to hammer against his ribs, not with the slow, heavy thud of power, but with the fast, terrified flutter of a trapped bird. Out from the gloom of the alder trees stepped Bram, Behind him emerged 3 older lads from the neighboring hamlet. Broad, heavy-set farmhands holding thick, knotted wooden cudgels and iron-tipped goads. Bram smiled. It was an ugly, terrifying sight in the pale moonlight. He was holding a leather strap in one hand, flexing his bruised wrist with the other. "Looking for the herbalist's girl, Mouse?" Bram sneered, taking a slow step forward. She was very convincing, wasn't she? All it took was a threat to burn her mother's dried stores, and she lied to you like a songbird. Milo's blood ran ice cold. "Bram," he stammered, taking a desperate step backward. His heel sank into the freezing mud of the shore. "Wait." "Wait?" Bram laughed, a harsh, barking sound that echoed over the dark lake. "You embarrassed me, Milo. You made me look weak in front of my father's men. You thought a little trick in the dirt made you a man." Milo frantically clenched his fists, trying with all his soul to reignite the magic. "Work," he begged the darkness inside him. "Please, work." Nothing happened. He was just Milo. Small, fragile, cowardly Milo, standing alone in the freezing mud against 4 armed men. "Look at him," Bram said to the farmhands, his eyes dark with malice. "He's shaking again." The mouse lost his teeth. Before Milo could turn to run, the first wooden cudgel struck him squarely across the ribs with a sickening crack. Milo gasped, the wind tearing from his lungs as he crashed sideways into the freezing water of the lake bed. Mud filled his mouth. Hands grabbed his hair, dragging him onto the stones. Another heavy boot smashed into his stomach, doubling him over in agony. Pain, raw, blinding, human pain, flooded his senses. He curled into a tight ball, weeping into the mud as the wooden clubs rained down on his shoulders, his back, his legs. "Remember this, blacksmith's boy," Bram shouted above the wet thuds of wood on flesh. "You are nothing. You will always be nothing." After what felt like an eternity, the blows stopped. Milo lay shivering in the dark slop at the water's edge, coughing up blood and lake water. His left arm hung uselessly, his ribs screaming with every ragged breath he drew. Through his swollen, tearing eyes, he saw Bram spit on the ground beside his head. "Leave him," Bram muttered to the others, turning back toward the village trail. "Let him freeze out here. Let him crawl home to his anvil if he can still walk." The heavy footsteps faded into the distance, leaving only the sound of the cold wind whistling through the dry reeds and the quiet, pitiful sobs of a boy broken on the mud. Pain was no longer just a feeling, it was the only world Milo knew. He lay in the freezing slop of the lake shore for a long time, listening to the steady, cold drip of his own blood mingling with the dark water. His left arm was numb and useless. Every breath felt like a dull iron nail driving into his chest, and his swollen face burned where Bram's boot had caught him. He could have crawled home. The village lights were a quarter-mile away, flickering like warm, golden embers through the mist. His father's forge was still warm. There was a hearth fire, hot tea, and a soft wool blanket waiting inside the smithy. But Milo did not look toward Mudplow. When he looked toward the village, he did not see safety. He saw Bram's cruel, laughing face. He saw Peter and Joran standing over him. And he saw Anka, looking down at her apron, leading him directly into the trap. A dark poison rage, hotter and far more reckless than fear, flooded his veins. "No," Milo gasped into the mud, his voice cracking with blood and spit. "No, I won't go back like this. I won't be the mouse again." Using his good right arm, he hauled his broken body up from the stones. He stumbled, his knees buckling beneath him, but he forced himself upright. He turned his back on the village, turned his back on the forge, and limped straight toward the black wall of the ancient forest. He didn't care about the warding stones. He didn't care about the elders' warnings. He needed the power back. He needed the fire in his chest. He needed to make them all pay. The deep woods at night were a place not meant for living eyes. The canopy overhead was so dense that not a single ray of moonlight touched the earth. The rain crashed down through the high branches, creating a deafening, chaotic roar that swallowed every sound. The air smelled of suffocating rot, ancient peat, and cold, wet stone. Milo dragged his left leg, leaning heavily against the rough, mossy bark of the ancient trees as he stumbled deeper and deeper into the dark. Branches tore at his hair, sharp thorns cut his face, and wet roots rose out of the mud to trip his broken feet. He fell once, twice, 3 times, slamming his broken ribs against the hard earth, screaming in silence as the pain tore through his mind. Yet he kept moving. Driven by a blind, mad obsession, he clawed his way through the underbrush, searching for the giant, dying elm where he had found the totem. "Where is it?" he wept, his ragged breath freezing in the air. "Give it back to me. Give it back." Finally, through the swirling gray fog, he saw the silhouette of the colossal tree. Its sprawling, twisted roots reached out like the pale, skeletal arms of a buried giant. Milo collapsed onto his knees between the roots, his fingers digging frantically into the freezing mud, tearing away wet leaves and moss. "Where is it?" he screamed, his voice swallowed by the roaring wind. "Where is the bone?" His fingers found nothing. No twigs, no crow feathers, no bleached animal skull. The earth beneath the elm was cold, empty and barren. Milo dropped his head against the wet bark of the tree, sobbing uncontrollably. The dark magic was gone. There was no secret gift, no dark pact, no iron strength waiting for him. There was only a broken, foolish boy bleeding out in the freezing rain. Then, the forest went dead silent. The chaotic roar of the rain suddenly vanished, as if a heavy velvet curtain had been dropped over the woods. The wind died down to absolute nothingness. The creaking branches fell still. The silence was so sudden, so total, that Milo could hear the frantic, terrified flutter of his own heart. A cold, heavy pressure settled over the clearing, a weight so immense that it forced Milo down flat onto his chest, pressing his face into the wet leaves. The very air grew thick, smelling instantly of crushed elderberries, old graves, and dried blood. Slowly, painfully, Milo raised his head. Stepping out from behind the trunk of the great elm was a figure of nightmares. It rose 10 feet into the air, a towering skeletal entity woven from dark, ancient wood, twisted vines, and moss-covered roots. Its body was thin as a winter shadow, yet carried the terrible, unyielding weight of a mountain. Resting upon its shoulders was a massive, bleached stag skull, its long, sprawling antlers reaching up into the high canopy like dead branches. And within the black, hollow eye sockets of the skull burned 2 points of brilliant, icy blue light. The Leshen. Milo stared up at the ancient guardian, his breath catching in his throat. The rage, the humiliation, the desire for revenge, all of it evaporated in an instant, replaced by a pure, primal terror that froze the blood in his veins. The Leshen did not move with anger. It stepped forward with a slow, deliberate rhythm, its wooden joints creaking like an old ship in a storm. A lone raven fluttered down from the high branches, landing softly upon one of its towering antlers, preening its dark feathers in the unnatural stillness. Milo tried to scramble backward, tried to scream, tried to beg for his life. But no sound came from his mouth. His body refused to obey him. The Leshen slowly lowered its antlered head, gazing down at the tiny broken human bleeding amongst its roots. It raised a long branch-like arm, its wooden fingers ending in sharp, iron-hard twigs. In those glowing blue eyes, Milo saw no malice, no cruelty, no hatred. He saw only the cold, unfeeling indifference of nature itself. The totem had not been a gift. It had been a crumb dropped by an ancient force that did not care if a boy lived or died, a fleeting spark of power that meant nothing to the keeper of the woods. And now the trespasser had returned to the sacred heart of the grove. The Leshen's wooden hand swept downward through the dark. Milo's eyes flew wide for one final, terrifying second. He should have stayed at the forge. He should have never gone so deep into the woods. The forest is quiet now, The rain falls gently upon the mossy earth of Velen, washing away the tracks, the mud, and the blood. Close your eyes now. The woods are still. You are safe in the warm light, and it is time to sleep.